My story takes place, I think, over the course of multiple different continents. I was born in Ethiopia, and I left when I was 2 years old during the political revolution, and I met my father for the first time when we came to America in 1980. Since then, I've been raised in America with all the privileges that come with that, and I've decided to become a writer partly as a way of trying to bring my own family's history in Ethiopia to life, at the same time create an identity for myself in America. And now I'm living in Europe, and I think that's a part of my continuation of trying to explore different identities, different histories in different parts of the world. I'm here in Paris at one of my favorite little cafes near my house, and I've been here for about almost 5 years now, since late 2007. And I came to Paris not necessarily planning on living here. It was more trying to, I think, get away from New York, and so I came just for that initial reason, just to find a certain escape and to come to Paris and maybe learn French and find how beautiful the city was. And what instead happened is I came and fell in love and found that Paris was a great place for me as a writer and a great place to work. And 5 years later, now I have a family and a very real home that I'm quite fond of here. How to Read the Air, it's the story of a young man, Jonas Wildemariam, who's been born in America and raised in America, but has never been able to quite find his home and his place. And so over the course of the novel, Jonas, who's also an English teacher, goes on a search to understand his parents' history and his own failing relationship with his wife, Angela. And so Jonas one day stops teaching his class and begins inventing a history for his father, a history that he himself doesn't personally know, but he thinks he can imagine that history by using the same skills as a novelist does. At the same time, Jonas, in the second part of the novel, also goes on a road trip throughout America, where he's driving the same journey that his parents made just before he was born, and he's trying to understand what happened between his parents while they were a young couple in America, and what happened to them when he was growing up, and why did he inherit so much violence and so much pain from them. The journey in the novel definitely happens both on a physical level, where Jonas is literally driving across America, but very much a journey through time and through emotions. He's also, as he's driving through the Midwest, he's also trying to imagine what happened to his parents when they made the same drive, and so he actually invents a history for them. And as he invents a history for them, he also begins to understand how he exists in America and what kind of effect that parents have had on him, and how much effect the past has had on him. So that journey is also a way for him to bring a sense of peace, I think, to himself. As he drives, he finds out that he can create a history for his parents that allows him to make sense of who they were, and that makes sense out of what his life has become. I began writing this novel, I would say, about almost 5 years ago. I think I was almost done with my first novel, The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears, and just before I was finished with that novel, I had a very clear image of a young man making this journey through the Midwest of America, and I didn't quite understand why, but I knew that it was somehow similar to my own biography and similar to my own family's history. And so I began the novel in short bursts and phases, where I started writing it, then I had to put it down for a while because I didn't quite know what kind of story I was trying to write or what I was trying to do with it. And it wasn't really until I think I moved to Paris about 5 years ago that the novel really began to take shape, and I think part of it was I had to get away from America to a certain degree. Being in Paris allowed me to have more emotional distance, I think, to be able to look back on my life and try to understand it, and to have an aesthetic vision that I think was slightly different, that came from being in a different country. I live in a neighborhood in Paris, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which is known for its literary history, for its culture, for its cafes, and of course for its bookstores. And I definitely I have very strong relationships with all of these places, with the cafes, with the bookstores in the neighborhood. I think reading has, as much as I love writing, reading has always been a part of that. I think every time I find myself unable to write or wanting to write, I find the quickest solution is for me to go back into the books that I love, or to find new books that I love. And right away I begin to feel that same desire to want to write, that same love of language that comes from reading. I find reading to be not only a source of inspiration, but a great source of solace. Reading is my own private little church, that every time I pick up a book, I feel like I've entered some sort of sacred space that allows me to understand myself, understand my world. I take great joy and pleasure in language, and when I read something beautiful, it's like walking into a room full of great art. I find myself quite moved and quite profoundly touched by great literature. My creative process is pretty simple these days. I used to be much more complicated, where I would write sometimes in the morning or sometimes very late at night. And now for the most part I try to do it, it's the first thing I do in the morning. I wake up and I have my coffee and I go to my cafe in the morning, and then I come back home and I work again in the afternoon in my office. And then when things are going well, then I take a break and I come to this cafe and I have a beer or aperitif, and I continue working until I feel like I'm almost completely exhausted, and then I go home and I read for a while, and then begin the same cycle over and over. My next project is sort of the conclusion, I think, between my first novel, this second novel here, How to Read the Air, and I think the next novel, because it takes place partly in Africa, just after the end of colonialism, at the start of independence, and also in America at the same time, right around 1968, 1970. And the next novel, I feel like, is a bookend to the first two books. It takes the same themes of conflict in Africa, of politics, of identity, of love, of the difficulties of finding relationships, of creating a new home, and it puts them into a slightly different context, because more of the novel takes place in countries in Africa, and more of the novel also takes place in America at the same time. And so for me, it's very much a novel that I think bridges the distance between the first two novels and kind of creates the last chapter, I think, in my work. The idea of being part of a list of important young writers, it's a great honor, of course, and a great privilege. I remember when the first list of writers came out by The New Yorker when I was still in college, and I thought it would be remarkable to be part of such a list someday. At the same time, as a writer, I don't actually ever think of it. My day-to-day work is very, very solitary, and when I'm writing out of a profound isolation, I think, and I don't really think too much about those things. They don't really become a part of my work, and they don't really interfere with my consciousness when I'm writing. I think I knew I wanted to be a writer from a very young age. I remember loving literature from the time I was 14, 15 years old. But I didn't necessarily have the courage to say I was going to be a writer. I think I knew I wanted to write for a very long time, and I began trying to write my first novel when I was maybe 17, 18 years old. But it really took me until I was in my early 20s before I could actually say that I wanted to be a writer. I think I had so much, and still have so much, respect for the literature that I love, that to try to think of myself as being a part of that same literary tradition seemed almost impossible and a little bit too much of a dream to actually be true. And so I think it took a long time before saying I wanted to be a writer, but I knew from the time I was quite young that stories were the only way for me to understand my world. Fortunately, I keep my own copies of my book very far away. That way I don't have to read it that often. It was 484 miles from my parents' home in Peoria, Illinois, to Nashville, Tennessee. A distance that in a 7-year-old red Monte Carlo driving at roughly 60 miles an hour could be crossed in 8 to 12 hours, depending on certain variables, such as the number of road signs offering side excursions to historical landmarks, and how often my mother, Miriam, would have to go to the bathroom. They called the trip a vacation, but only because neither of them was comfortable with the word honeymoon, which in its marrying of two completely separate words, each of which they understood on its own, seemed to imply when joined together a lavishness that neither was prepared to accept. They were not newlyweds, but their 3 years apart had made them strangers. They spoke to each other in whispers, half in Amharic, half in English, as if any one word uttered too loudly could reveal to both of them that, in fact, they had never understood each other. They had never really known who the other person was at all. When I hear the novel in another language, I always find it quite remarkable that someone took the time to make the translation, and some languages lend themselves to a kind of rhythmic grace that it's amazing to be able to actually hear that same rhythm in a language that some cases I can understand a little bit, in some cases that I can't understand at all. And yet at the same time I can still feel the same rhythm of language that I had when I was writing it, and that when I feel it when I read it in English as well. The Brazilian cover and even the title, I find them quite beautiful. It's a slightly different take on the title than the English one, but it still feels quite honest and quite captures the mood and the spirit of the novel, I think, quite well. And the cover, I think, is lovely. It does a beautiful job of capturing the sense of a journey and the sense of a kind of emotional clouds hanging over the novel in a way that no other cover has done before yet. I think I've like many people, I've loved the idea of wanting to go to Brazil. It's I think of it as being one of the most fascinating and diverse countries in the world right now. It's a mix of Latin American, African, European, and indigenous cultures all wrapped up into this very large, very beautiful country that's enormous and growing. And of course, these days, Brazil has entered the world stage as an enormously important economic power and cultural power. And so I think more and more, especially Americans and Europeans, we find ourselves looking towards countries like Brazil with profound admiration, and also a sense that it would be really important to understand that place a little bit better. If I had to send a message to my readers in Brazil, it would be that if I hope that if you do read this book, that you find that this book becomes a part of your own culture as well, that you find yourselves able to relate, understand to the characters and to the story, because it's not just the story of immigrants or the story of Americans or Europeans or Africans, it's the story of individuals trying to create their lives and trying to create a home and trying to find love. And I think that same story is true in Brazil as it is in America, and I hope that you find that experience when reading this novel.